What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again, and this time we are here with Titan To Tachyons. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you all here. We are here with Sally and Trevor.
Hey, thanks for having us here.
Yeah, it's so awesome to have you guys here. This new album, Vonals, is absolutely beautiful. This is like instrumental bliss, as I call it. It's really just an epic emotional listen. What was the sort of thought process behind the making of this album? Was there kind of like a preconceived vision of what you wanted this to sound like, or was there like a lot of improvising and a lot of trial and error involved?
I guess a bit of both. I have specific concepts that I express through the music. Like it's very visually influenced from different surrealist artists or even 60s op art, stuff like that. And so I express that musically, and then we expand on these concepts with improvisation within certain sections and boundaries.
And being that you have these sort of surrealist intentions, like as somebody who loves Salvador Dali and Giorgio Chirico and a lot of these different surrealist visual artists, was this more or less kind of your interpretation of the concept, or were you trying to kind of make it like very documentorial and kind of like explaining what these artists were about?
More an interpretation, just like a very loose inspiration. I mean, I love Dali as well, and there's visual concepts in his work, like he has a lot of melting or disintegration, or even the notion of time. So I try to express that musically, like having like disintegration, for example, if you have like a motif that like slowly gets pulled apart and becomes more angular and dissonant. And I feel like the melting thing is expressed by just the sort of the timing or even just bending notes or making things sound like they're going backwards or warping, things like that.
Hmm. In terms of like the sound that it was, why do you feel like this sound best represents this sort of surrealist intention that you want to incorporate in there?
I guess it's just my personal interpretation of that, and however that comes out, it just sort of represents the way I perceive that, or how um, like it's sort of like sound painting or soundtrack. Like I'm a visual artist as well. Like I paint and take influence in the same matter, so it's just like a different expression of that, really.
Yeah. Being that both of you are involved in multiple projects, Trevor, you being involved with Mr. Bungle and Phantomas, and Sally, you being involved with many, many different projects as well. How different of a mindset is it with this particular project as opposed to your other ones? Why don't we start with you, Trevor?
This project is kind of more collaborative than a lot of stuff that I do. I mean, you mentioned Bungle and Phantomas. Phantomas doesn't really hasn't been active in years, and when Mr. Bungle was writing music years ago, 20 years ago, or 25, it was definitely a collaborative thing. But a lot of the stuff I do now is more either I'm a sideman and I'm interpreting someone else's music, or I'm calling all the shots. So Titans is kind of the first like real collaborative thing that I've done in quite a while. Sally would come up with these parts. Sometimes her and Matt would figure out a couple parts together, and then they'd come to me, and I try and figure my way in there. Or sometimes Sally and I would she would bring something to me, and I'd figure out a bass part, and then Matt would have to figure out what his role was. And
Hmm.
then once we got into the rehearsal studio and started learning the pieces, there was more collaboration in there. Well, also from Kenny and all of us kind of trying to make the songs work and make the transitions work. And so it's been quite a while since I've been in a situation like that where I'd like get together in the rehearsal room and make collective decisions.
And Sally, how different of an experience was this for you as opposed to Orb Weaver?
It's very different in the fact that I'm essentially leading this. Like as Trevor was saying, like I'll write, the majority of the material on guitar, so everything's kind of laid out, and I have a draft arrangement, and then as we bring it to the band, then we collaborate and figure out everyone's parts. And I like I was saying, I do the artwork as well, and so everything's like I sort of have creative direction there. Whereas Org Weaver was mostly so Randy Pyro, the other guitar player, it was sort of flipped in that way. Like it was more like he was leading that and like writing everything. And then I would come in, like sort of how Trevor was saying, I would come in and figure out my parts or solos around what he had done. So it's essentially reversed.
Mhm. Does everybody in the band kind of need to be in the same frame of mind and be in the same headspace when collaborating together, or is maybe having different experiences and different emotions and feeling differently about certain things can maybe actually help enhance the songwriting process in a way?
I'd say, yeah, the fact that we all do different things. Matt and Kenny also do a zillion different bands, and I think all of that, comes together somehow in the room. I was gonna say that there was like there's some stuff. I used to have this experience in Phantomos too, where there's parts where we're playing the same thing, but we're all counting it differently, because we're hearing the one in a different place, or we can't unlearn the way we first learned it or something, and but that kind of just adds to the, as long as we feel like it's tight and we're playing it together, it doesn't really matter how you're thinking about it to a degree.
Especially with having two bass players, right? You guys kind of take the Melvins roots in a way and bring that. People like to make fun of bass players in rock and roll, and you guys just say, "Fuck it, we'll have two of them," right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the fun thing about that is that we have to, we're not just, we rarely play in unison. Matt and I we're constantly like trying to negotiate, stay out of each other's way and orchestrate with. I mean, guitar is, fairly low range instrument too, so we have to, with all three of those voices, we have to figure out how they're going to work without it being like a wall, like corn or something, where it's just everyone's playing the exact same thing all the time.
Hmm.
We're trying to like create, have different layers and make it more interesting. Have, put a third harmony in there. Why not?
Definitely, and add to that real low tune as well. Make the whole place shake.
Yeah.
Um, do you now? In the end, this is very instrumental music as well, and I think with having this instrumental intention, I feel like the feeling of it is also very open to interpretation. So, Sally, being that you are addressing this surrealism as an art history major, I'm eating this concept up. But for a lot of people, do you feel like this album could also still be open to interpretation?
Oh, definitely. And I mean, surrealism is just one of, I guess, like two or three concepts that I go with. Like, I'm also a big science fiction nerd, and I use so like concepts from there, or like narratives. Like, I mean, I love reading like Philip K. Dick, and I grew up watching Red Dwarf, and so a lot of the times, like I'll use those ideas to help me form song structures or different emotions or textures. And then going beyond that, like I started reading into quantum physics and neuroscience and theories about consciousness. And so in ways, like I try to express that and relate it to also um, the improvisational parts, where you're kind of, actually there's a great book on this too that I was reading, The Jazz of Physics, where the saxophone player Stefan Alexander, he's relating similar concepts where you have the way, say, quantum particles behave is very similar to how you would navigate through improvisational sections. Like if you had, like, the more that you know where you're going, the more limited your choices are, but then the more coherent it can be. And if you have no clue whatsoever, I mean, these particles or the music or whatever it is can go in any direction. It becomes very chaotic. And so I also link that to how this is going down a wormhole.
Please, please, I love it when we go down these wormholes. Please.
Um, so that was something I read a few years ago, and then I also came across this neuroscientist called Anil Seth, and he was talking about how your perception and your consciousness also works in a similar way. So you have these limitations on what you perceive, and that allows you to function as an animal or a person or whatever it is. Like you have a limited color spectrum or a limited audio spectrum, and so you see the world in a certain way. But once you start to lift these barriers, things become a lot more hallucinatory. And it's like the way he put it is perception is controlled hallucinations, and hallucinations are uncontrolled perception. So I really love that. And again, I drew the parallel with the improvisation, where the more structure you have, like the more musically coherent it is. And
oh, you were saying?
yeah, yeah, basically, yeah. So the opposite, like the less structure, the more chaotic and hallucinatory, and so that's just basically like a whole range of influences and expression that I try to bring through in what we write.
Well, and you mentioned like these different scientific developments. I took a class in art school called Art, Science, and the Spiritual, and you learn on how, as we evolved in art history, science with there was also a lot of scientific developments and philosophical ideas that influenced that. You know, Freud and surrealism is one of the most common, but you see how Ernst Haeckel's theories of light influenced Impressionism, and you see how certain elements of corporatism influenced like the pop art movement. So we are not immune to the reality and the perception of the world that we live in as well. And did you always think of these concepts before you before you began the actual creative process, both the visual and sonic aspects?
I think like when I compose, like it's not, it comes from different angles. Like sometimes you're not thinking at all, which is I guess most of the time. Um, like when you're like writing music, you know, and so I kind of where the influences come in is where I start to refine material or look for song structures, and then in further steps when I start to do the artwork, that's obviously a large part of where these visuals come in. Um, yeah.
And being again going back to like the different projects you've all been involved in, because I do see like for instance I know that Kenny's involved with Imperial Triumphant, which has a lot of jazz influences, which I definitely see in here and Titan. Does any of your other projects maybe help influence this as well, especially Trevor, because you know playing with what regardless of whether it will be Mr. Bungle or Phantomas, you're playing with you know Mike Patton, who's an experimental mad scientist of music. So I'd imagine this experimental element could also help with the songwriting of this too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like everything influences everything else. Every experience I have improvising with a group of musicians or hearing something, or seeing art or whatever, like it all kind of gets filtered through there, So there isn't anything specific that I would say lent itself to how I approach this, how I approach Sally's music, other than just like using my ear and trying to figure out what sounds good and how I mean, there's some parts where I had total freedom to create my own parts, so I just did something that I liked, and didn't think about it too much, I just thought about where it fit in range wise, am I going to harmonize the guitar line, or am I going to like kind of play against the other bass line, or whatever the role is. I think just my experience as a musician in general just all goes into that.
Definitely. And do you feel like because when I listen to the music as well, when you compare a track such as Neutron Wrangler to Vacuum Symmetry to Wax Hypnotic, it just seems like every song also has its own emotional elements behind it. Is every song almost representative of your particular feeling in a way, or is this representative of sort of like analyzing in a way?
I think it's more of an emotional thing, like each one is telling a certain story or an image, and it's not necessarily intended to be completely different from each other. It's just that's kind of what comes out. Like it's not like I ever sit down and specifically say, okay, I want this one to be super metal or super weird or whatever. It's just however it kind of ties together and makes sense. And a lot of the times contrast does come in from that.
Yeah. And I also consider this album to be very what I call shuffle friendly, because I know a lot of artists, they want you to start off with the first song and end with the last song, but given the experimentation and the sort of like surrealist nature behind it, do you think that people could start off with maybe like Blue Thought Particles and then maybe end with Vacuum Symmetry, start off with Critical Paranoia, and then maybe end with Wax Hypnotic or something like that? Could a listener approach this from any angle that they so choose?
Yeah, definitely. I think the order, this one's unique in like the order works kind of anyway, whereas the first album, I feel like took you on more of a journey, and it was interesting in that from start to finish, it actually ended up being in the order that I wrote the songs, which kind of, I guess, made sense as to the development. But I feel like, yeah, shuffle friendly is probably a good way to put this. It's you could approach it from many different angles and still end up with like largely the same experience.
I think this the fact that the songs are fairly long too kind of helps that. Like a lot of times sequencing in an album to me is, I always feel like there's a with my own stuff anyway. There's like a perfect sequence that I have to discover, you know, and I spend a lot of time like experiment trying to figure out what that sequence is going to be until I, you know, because I grew up, you know, I grew up listening to vinyl records where, you know, I'd put on side A and then I'd flip it over and listen to side B, you know, and which I realize a lot of people don't do anymore. But the Vonals, I think, is partly because there's, you know, there's only a handful of songs and they're all fairly lengthy and there's a lot of changes within each one. It does make sense for it to be kind of in any order. I mean, and we've also, when we've been playing it live, we've been doing it in different order. I mean, that kind of just goes without saying, you know, sometimes the live trip that you want to take people on is going to be different than the recording experience.
I'll get into that in a second, but I actually wanted to talk about that. If you were going to bring in, you know, songs from your first album and then songs from this one, do you think that's also going to maybe add a different type of context to it, or maybe create a whole different vibe altogether? If you play a newer song and then play an older song and then play, you know, a couple older ones and then do a new one, like if you focus on a whole span of the catalog, do you think it'll add like a different layer of meaning to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like the first album was more like melodic and groove focused, whereas this one's more abstract and so like more of like a visceral thing or so yeah, like that. If we did switch it up like that, I think that would definitely add another layer to the live show. But it does, you know, having most of the first album was as a trio, like we just had the one track with Trevor. So I guess, you know, if we play that live, maybe I'll just be like, hey, Trevor, go get a beer and we'll come back later.
Hey, Trevor, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea.
I'm into that.
Yeah. Adam from Killswitch Engage, he would walk off the stage in the middle of the set still playing and grab a beer from the bar. So I think, you know, I guess
dedication.
I guess signaling the bartender was just out of the question, but you know.
I think, you know, as a bass player, I never get to take breaks. Like I'm constantly playing. Everyone wants to play over the bass, you know. So like that would be great to be able to take a tackle break during the set.
Yeah, that's terrible too. You never, bass players never get a break, and people just make all the memes and jokes about them. Like it's like, even though the bands would be nothing without the bass player. You know, I always say Lemmy and Peter Steele and Sting. That's all you need to say right there.
Right.
Yep.
Getting
When it comes to getting this sort of inspiration to whether it will be the concepts that you want to address in the album, or even just like coming up with different parts and thinking of different musical ideas, do both of you kind of need to put yourself in a specific place at a certain time in order to cultivate ideas, or does inspiration just strike out of the blue for all of you?
I have to sometimes I have to book myself to write music. You know, I have to set aside everything else, not do gigs, whatever, and be like, okay, this week I'm gonna treat it like a job. I'm gonna get up in the morning and start working, you know. But I mean, in terms of inspiration, I've never really I don't know, I don't have any secrets on that. Sometimes it comes out of the blue. Sometimes it comes out when I'm trying to practice. I'll be working on technique or something, and all of a sudden I'll be like, oh wait, here's an idea. I better stop practicing and write this down. You know, I have scraps of paper all over the place with stuff like that on it. Yeah. So I mean, other times just forcing yourself to work to get in the habit of working and making it habitual is can inspire inspiration. You know, definitely. You know, it'll you just keep pushing got to just keep pushing.
How about for you, Sally? Because between New York and New Zealand, you're going all over the world and whatnot. I'd imagine that there's a lot of different sources of external and internal inspiration as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, where I am right now, I'm in Tairua, which is like this little beach town, and as you can see behind me, there's like bush right there, and it's very peaceful and quiet, and like so this is somewhere when I was living here, like I like to come just like hole up and work on music and not really have any distractions, stuff like that. But generally, I mean, it's very similar to what Trevor was saying. Like having a routine is really important. Like making time to write. Um, like if you have a goal, like like for example, working towards this album, we did that in a very short amount of time, and so I would kind of have like a schedule where, like, okay, I'm going to get up every morning, and the first 2 hours I'm just going to play guitar and just almost like a stream of consciousness thing, like just see what comes out without really thinking too much about it or like jamming along to records or whatever it is. And that's kind of like the main time when ideas would come out. And also, playing with other people helps a lot too. Like I do a lot of improv gigs, and sometimes I'll come up with ideas doing that, or particularly like watching other people play music. Like sometimes that'll spark an idea, or but yeah, I mean, it's really just about the routine, and like Trevor was saying as well. I mean, like sometimes when you're doing something completely different, but you just have your guitar in your hands, like an idea will come out because you're not really, thinking like purposely thinking about writing something, and an idea will just spark. But yeah, usually when you specifically sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write something, like nothing's going to come out, you know.
Yeah.
So just making this time like every day to be like, okay, these 2 hours, I'm going to sort of work on it without intentionally working, if that makes sense. Like,
Definitely. Definitely. And
yeah.
speaking of New Zealand, by the way, sorry if it's a little off topic, but I am wearing a shirt for one of New Zealand's finest metal bands as well, Ulcerate. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah, so
Awesome.
I picked the shirt for the occasion. But going back to what you said about improv too, is there like a right way to improvise? Is there like a strategy behind improvising or any sort of forethought that goes into it? Because I tried improvisational poetry at times, and when I say that it was awful, it like you would rather listen to Lulu than to listen to my improvisational poetry, and so like is there a way to get good at improvising, or is improvising just improvising?
I took a lesson from Mark Dresser, who's a great bass player. He played with Anthony Braxton for years and did a lot of stuff with Tim Byrne, John Zorn, and stuff. And he's one of my mentors. And this was years ago. I asked him about improvising. It's like, what do you think about when you're improvising? How do you make it work? Or whatever. He said, I just try to make something interesting happen, and that always stuck with me. I don't think there's any right way to improvise. It's to me, it's the same as having a conversation with someone. I mean, I'm improvising right now. I didn't plan what I'm going to say. I have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth next, but I've been speaking English long enough that I know how to form words, and I know if I'm going off on a tangent or if I'm taking too long to explain this answer. So you gotta. There's a certain amount of awareness you have to have, but also sometimes you need to just kind of get into the zone and be cathartic about it. But you also don't want to knock people off the stage and while you're having
Yeah, if you're a hardcore band, you get an A+.
True, that's true.
Yep. And hey, you worked with Mike Patton. He knocks everybody off the stage.
Oh yeah. I've been hit in the head with objects before.
Yeah, so have I, and I wasn't even part of the show. so, and I have two more questions for both of you, and kind of we were going to talk about the live presence. Actually, is there at all anything that ties playing live together into songwriting, or do you consider them two completely separate arts in a way? Like when you are playing the material live and you're replicating it, it almost has to put you back in the same emotional state of mind that you were when you were recording it, right?
Yeah, there's definitely tie-ins. I mean, one thing that I like about having these sort of loose improvisational sections is that it just keeps you present and it keeps you communicating with each other, and it does bring you back to whatever you were originally trying to express. So it's, yeah, you're just recreating the same thing in different ways with, like largely trying to capture the same energy, which I do prefer that to having something that's just like completely composed and it just comes down to muscle memory, and you can just you end up just like zoning out because you don't have to think about it. Like I like being present and having it different every time.
Hmm.
I think for me, there's a different joy that comes out of writing. It's different from the live thing, like once we've really learned the music and it's under our fingers, we know how to, we don't have to worry about how the song is going to go. I mean, we still have to be present, like Sally was saying, and sometimes there's improv that's things are going to be different, but at the same time, you're kind of liberated in a way. You're like, oh, I know how this goes. I know what's coming next. I can just enjoy this. I can enjoy this heavy groove or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whereas like writing is a kind of a different. To me, it's like a totally separate entity. Really.
Definitely. And the final question I wanted to ask you, I saved the most difficult one for last. I'll let you two decide who answers first. How do you know when you're finished with a song?
It feels finished.
That's funny. I was just having this conversation with someone, I think last night, actually. Yeah, it's so arbitrary, it's, I mean, you can always just keep adding, adding layers, but I mean, sometimes that just makes it worse, so
Yeah.
it also depends if you have how much of a clear idea you have about the piece before you start, I suppose. But I don't know. It's like anything. Like I do, probably I would imagine Sally feels similar to like when she's painting, and I do a lot of paper collage stuff, and again, I can always add stuff, and I can always but I don't know, get to a point where you like step back from it and you look at it and you say, is this space filled? Does that space have enough space in it? Is this are all the links together that I want there? It's just, it is just kind of a feel, like I was saying.
There was
like Vacuum Symmetry was kind of a strange song for me because that one I spent the longest on, and it never felt finished. Like I worked on that one for a couple of months, and I was like, there's something, it's not working, it's not coming together, I'm not sure what it is. And then so that one definitely took a long time to wrap up and have that feeling. Like I had different arrangements, different forms, like this is a complete song, but like something was missing. And eventually I got to the point where I'm like, okay, now it feels like it's working, it's a song, it's flowing, So it's just definitely like an intuitive thing.
Mm-hmm. There was actually one other question that I forgot to ask that I wanted to bring. Being that you both also work in visual art as well, is there at all maybe a similar aspect to creating visual art as sonic art as well? Because when you look at any musician, whether it would be Jacob Bannon of Converge or John Baisley of Baroness, you see how like they're able to kind of make their visual art one with the music in a way, but then there's artists like Jason Newsted, for example, where his visual art has nothing to do with his music. So is there maybe at all a similar form of expression channeled into both the visual and sonic art, or are they two completely separate sides of who you are?
I mean, for me, they're tied together. Like I'm just expressing two sides of the same idea through the music and art. And music, as sort of describing before, was like just more like I'm mostly visually influenced in the way I think about composing or structuring.
Yeah, for me, they're really similar. Like it's kind of about making choices. Do I want this note and this chord together, or do I want these two images together? And sometimes I move them around. Let's put that note in the bottom. Let's add another note to that chord or something. Would be the same thing if I cut out a bunch of images and was able to physically shuffle them around, and see what it looks like.
Definitely. So before we go, I want to thank you both so much for your time and for such a awesome conversation as well. And most importantly, thank you for this amazing new album, Vonals. I think it's, whether people want to label it as prog or jazz, I just think it's amazing music to immerse yourself into. It's not just an album, it's an experience. Is there just anything else that you would like to promote in terms of tours or maybe even new music in the works?
Um, yeah, I guess still figuring out what's happening next year. We'll be like I'm a whole way here in New Zealand. I'm going to start thinking about the next album and writing for that, and we'll have a couple of performances in March when we all get back into town. And but yeah, mostly, thanks for having us on the show and taking the time to talk with us.
Anytime, anytime.
Can
It
I,
was an honor.
Sally? Can I bring up the trio record that we're gonna put out next year?
Oh, right, yeah, of course.
So, because this, then I can plug two things. So, I started a small record label called Riverworm Records during the pandemic, and there's only 4 things out right now, but early next year we're gonna put out this record that Sally and I did with the drummer Greg Fox. It's improv record, and I'm playing upright bass on it. It's totally a different thing from Titan, but yeah, probably look for that in the new year, I guess.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Titan To Tachyons. Be sure to check out Vonals if you haven't already. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.